Hello, and welcome to week 10 of the Atlantic Abolition and Slavery module. This week, we're going to be picking up where we left off last time after the 1807 abolition of the slave trade. Now, it's important to remind ourselves that that doesn't mean that slavery has been completely abolished in Britain and its dominions. What the 1807 Slave Trade Act meant was that you couldn't exchange money for slaves within Britain. The slave trade continued to thrive in the Caribbean. And also, it failed to tackle the fact that there were slave societies. There were islands in the Caribbean that Britain owned, which were self sustaining, where slaves had children, those children were raised. So, slavery very much continued after the 1807 abolition of the Slave Trade Act. And it took some time for abolitionists really to notice this and tackle it. And between 1807 and 1823, there was actually a real lack of action and combined effort from abolitionists to do anything. So between 1807 and 1823, it was quite a quiet time. However, as more research continued to be done in the Caribbean and Anglican and Quaker groups looked into it further, they realized there was much more to be done to tackle the evil of slavery. Because conditions on the plantations remained poor. And even though there were dedicated ships that sought off the coast of Britain to stop people exchanging slaves, really slavery continued. And it's in 1823 that the Anti Slavery Society is formed and start producing petitions and printed propaganda and research highlighting how ineffective the 1807 slave trade abolition had been. Even though it meant more slaves were surviving journeys, slavery continued. And you get in this time period members of the Anti Slavery Society, more and more of them are actual MPs in a position to change legislation. One of the most famous of which is MP James Stephen, who I've included on the bottom of this side, who was married to Sarah Wilberforce, the sister of William Wilberforce, and actually, really interestingly, the grandfather of Virginia Woolf. And James Stephen and a lot of these MPs got together and wanted to create new policy to tackle what was happening throughout the entire empire, not just inside Britain. Although they faced stern opposition, particularly from the London Society of West India Planters and Merchants, who were a group who represented the plantation owners. So it's really in the 20s and early 30s that you start to get abolitionists moving again and doing things. And you get these societies popping up throughout England. There's about 70 of these kind of anti-slavery groups that form. And one of the really important groups and often forgotten about groups are the roles of women and women as abolitionists, one of the most famous of which is based here in Birmingham, which was the Birmingham Ladies Society for the Relief of Negro Slaves, which was founded 2 years after the anti-slavery group formed in London. And the reason why women were so important in the abolition of slavery, but often forgotten by the historiography, is because women in the mid 19th century were obviously in charge of the home a lot of the time, which meant they were in charge of buying household goods. And what the Birmingham Ladies Society did was get together and boycott products that were produced as a result of slavery, such as sugarcane. So in Birmingham in particular, products that were derived from the slave trade went down. The demand for them went down because they were in charge of catering for houses and households. And some of the most famous women of the society, who I'd like you to go and look at before the seminar, include the Quaker Mary Hornchurch, Lucy Townsend, Sophia Sturge, and Sarah Wedgwood. Now, these all have links with industrialists of Birmingham and influence the men of the town who were in these enlightened circles, like the Lunar Society. Sarah Wedgwood, in particular, is related to Josiah Wedgwood, who's a famous ceramist in the West Midlands. And what's interesting about these abolition groups, they often become women's rights groups afterwards as well. So there are links between the success of abolition movements and the beginning of women's rights movements and what would eventually become the suffragettes. Because this group, once slavery is eventually abolished, becomes the female society of Birmingham. So they continue to do activism for women as well. And these women's rights groups and anti-slavery groups are part of wider social and political movements of the 19th century. And the reason there is so much enthusiasm for abolitionist movements in the 20s and 30s is because this is really the formation of a middle class, or a middling sort, as it is often referred to in this time period, in Britain. This has happened because of various factors. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the 1760s, has created a group of people who can progress up social classes. So you have a middling sort that is formed. Men have also made their name during the Napoleonic Wars as well. People who were born into poverty all of a sudden have more disposable income, becoming educated and more politically conscious. And this is this middle class that really drives enthusiasm for the abolitionist movement, because they understand what it is like to be oppressed, and they want to enfranchise workers and seize the means of production. A lot of these MPs who are abolitionists are not from the traditional landed elite. So this changes the whole political landscape of Britain. And it's important to understand how education and social mobility, as a result of the Industrial Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, changed politics and thoughts on slavery. And it's in the 1830s that you get strong social movements from the lower and middle classes as they try and gain more rights. As the century goes on, this is really the focus of Karl Marx's views on class struggle. So the lower and middle classes are trying to enfranchise themselves. And in the 1830s, you actually get something called the Swing Riots, which takes place in the south of England, where workers, agricultural workers, riot for better working conditions. And the abolitionist movements are really tied intricately to these. And in the mid 19th century, you get this shift away from the conservative Tory party, who has been dominant in politics for most of British history, towards what is known as the Whig Party, who are constitutional monarchists. They want Parliament to have more influence, to interact with the monarchy, absolutely, but really a focus on democracy. They promote religious toleration, human rights, and economic and personal freedoms, which is known as a laissez-faire policy. And they're really representing the middle class who are getting the vote. And they push a more left-wing progressive agenda. And the Whigs are voted in the 1830s. And what you get in 1830 exactly, I should say, and what you get over the next 2 decades is more social reform in Britain than you've seen in the previous century and a half. And it is no coincidence that the abolition of slavery as a whole is introduced 3 years later. So what you get, 1830, the Whigs are voted in this popular movement of more left-wing politics, this shift from conservative right-wing values to the left. And in 1832, you get something called the Reform Act, the Great Reform Act, which gives more power to the middle and lower class than they've ever had before. So traditionally, the landed gentry had dominated politics, and this was because they owned the majority of the land. And what you had before 1832 is small areas of the country represented by MPs, and you get disproportionate voting system. So the most famous example is Old Salem in Wiltshire, which was one hill owned by Prime Minister Pitt, and it was completely uninhabited. But it had two MPs representing it in Parliament. Meanwhile, areas like Birmingham and Manchester, which had really formed in the Industrial Revolution, still had no MPs representing the hundreds of thousands of people who lived in those areas. And what the Whigs do is change the entire political system to be more representative of the actual population, as these people who lived in these new cities demanded reform. So that's where the abolition of slavery comes in. That's the important context. The Whigs are representing the enfranchised working class of England, and the working class want workers' rights. And in 1833, you eventually get the abolition of slavery, which I've included in the middle of this screen. A year later, you get Poor Law Amendment Act, so more money for the poor. And in 1859, you eventually get the Liberal Party. So you can see throughout the 19th century, you have a move towards more socialist policies. And that's when we get the 1833 abolition of slavery. And it is to do with what I've just been discussing, but there are other reasons why this happens as well. So you have these groups petitioning for the abolition of slavery. Politics is completely overhauled. The middle class have more of a say, but sugarcane had become less profitable in the early 30s. Maintaining these Caribbean islands became more of a chore for the political elite, and more expensive, especially after the Haitian Revolution, where you get a series of increased slave revolts throughout the Caribbean. In 1831, you have a big one on Jamaica known as the Baptist War. And this more liberal elite, led by Charles Earl, or Earl Grey, is basically more sympathetic to the slaves. And what happens in 1833? You have the abolition of slavery as a whole because of all the factors I've been outlining. This is often portrayed in historiography as the defining moment slavery ends. But as I've spoke about in the last few weeks, it's more of a slow process than perhaps we initially thought. Because what actually happens on the 22nd of July, 1833, slavery is abolished throughout the kingdoms. However, the vast majority of slaves become what is known as apprentices. So actually, only children under 6 were completely free. All the other slaves become what is known as an apprentice, which you will all be familiar with the term now, is basically someone who works for free or for very minimal wage, and in return they gain job experience. And what the politicians of Britain do is they introduce this kind of transitioned end to slavery, the first phase of which is known as apprenticeships. And that basically ends in August 1838. The first phase ends in 1838, where more slaves are freed. And then the second wave ends in 1840. So even though you have the 1833 Abolition of Slavery Act, it's probably more accurate to say in the 40s is when slavery in Britain and its entire empire is completely abolished. Because even in the 33 Act, there are exemptions to geographic areas where slavery can continue, mainly where the East India Company are still in charge. So parts of India and smaller islands slavery continues. And these exemptions don't end until 1843. So again, there is no single end to slavery in 33. It is a very much a transitioned end, but still really important. And as a result of these different changes to the law between 1833 and 1843, 800,000 slaves are eventually freed from British control, which is obviously incredibly important. But the attitudes towards slavery by most people in Britain remains an incredibly complicated, difficult, and controversial topic, which is really most highlighted by the 1837 Slave Compensation Act, which is extraordinary because the government feels bad about taking people's slaves away from them. And rather than giving slaves compensation for the hardships that they'd faced, the slave owners are compensated at huge expense to the taxpayer. Um, and £20 million is raised to pay slave owners for their losses, which is approximately 40% of the entire British annual income. So, as you can imagine, this has a hugely detrimental effect on the British economy and continued to do so for a long time. In one way or another, the loans that were used to facilitate the Slave Compensation Act were only finally repaid in 2015, which is extraordinary. And when people realized this, it caused an enormous controversy that hundreds of years later, we were still paying, still kind of the consequences of repaying slave owners was still influencing British policy. And all in total, 40,000 British slave owners are granted payments. So they are wide ranging in their numbers and impact. And it really does go to show that people still sympathize with slave owners rather than the slaves in this situation. But even after slavery is ended, there is still enthusiasm for it in the rest of the world. And what is really interesting is that Britain very much becomes the epicenter of global anti slavery movements from the late 30s and early 40s onwards. Um, One of the most important societies and organizations is called the British and Foreign Anti Slavery Society, which is really kind of organized by a Quaker. And again, it's really important to acknowledge how important Quakers were in abolitionism. An individual called Joseph Sturge, who continues to travel throughout the world and do research into the experience of slaves and free slaves in America, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. And it is Joseph Sturge and this organization's aim to get rid of slavery throughout the entire world. So, after so long of Britain being such a driving force within Atlantic slavery, it shifts drastically towards being a force in global anti slavery movements. Um, and this organization, which was established in 1839, continues to this day. Um, Throughout the 20th century, they have campaigned against Belgium influence in the Congo, treatment of Aboriginals in America, in Australia and New Zealand, and slavery that still exists in the world now, which is surprisingly extensive. And one of the most important events in kind of global anti-slavery movements is the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention, which is held in Exeter Hall in London. Now, despite it being called the World Anti-Slavery Convention, it was primarily comprised of British abolitionists, with um, a decent contingent of American ones as well. However, the slavery convention is kind of infamous for, firstly, demonstrating how a lot of the rest of the world wasn't interested in anti slavery, but also the misogyny and social attitudes demonstrated by abolitionists as well. Many women, so I discussed the Birmingham Society earlier, many women had been important abolitionists and wanted to attend the event. However, men refused to allow them to participate. They could watch, but not contribute. So, this World Anti Slavery Convention really becomes a catalyst for women's rights as well. And the conflicting social values that are demonstrated by white male abolitionists who want to free black men, but still oppress women of the country. So it's a very interesting event, and we'll go over it in more detail in the seminar. And what happens throughout the 1840s is this desire to enfranchise workers, which has a strong movement in Britain because of its centrality to the Industrial Revolution. You have a series of revolutions in 1848, which are really often forgotten by popular press and the media, but they're incredibly important. And throughout Central, Northern, and Eastern Europe, there are working class and middle class revolutions that seek to stop the exploitation of workers. And it really is an extension of the abolitionist movements we see in Britain. The 1848 revolutions are sometimes called the springtime of the people. And we'll talk about the links between abolitionism and these revolutions in the seminar as well. But essentially, what you get in Eastern Europe is serfdom and exploitation of agricultural and industrial workers. And when people in Poland and Denmark and Romania and Hungary see slaves being freed, they also want more rights. And the mid 1800s are really a time of overthrowing the remnants of these ancient systems. There's another French Revolution that happens. So, abolitionism and British abolitionism of the 20s and 30s has these knock on global effects, which are really important to understand as well. I'll put my main concluding points on this slide. And before you come to the seminar, I'd like you to read Douglas Maynard's The World's Anti-Slavery Convention of 1840, which I touched upon, but this goes into more detail and we'll be discussing it in the seminar. So that's available via JSTOR through the Mississippi Valley Historical Review, Volume 43, Number 3. And that's pages 452 to 471. And then I want you to think about the following question, which we'll be discussing in detail. One, why did the abolitionist movement lose momentum between 1807 and 1823? Not much happens at all in that time period. Why did the Tory party lose popular support in the 1820s and 1830s, which is so central to abolitionist success? Three, I want you to think about what was the role of apprenticeships and how were they different from slavery? Was it just slavery in another form? I want you to think about that. And then finally, what are the 1848 revolutions? Why are the 1848 revolutions considered an extension of abolitionist movements? So read that article, think about those questions, and I'll see you in the seminar. Thank you very much.